Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of InkSoft's Sell More Merch podcast. I'm really excited to have a very special guest today and illuminate their story and their background. So without further ado, Rishi of Underground Printing. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, JP. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, great. Well, let's get started with sort of the origin story, how you got into the space and how underground printing became a thing and came into existence. So can you share the background with us?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're based in Michigan, specifically Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the University of Michigan is located. And my co-founder and I, Ryan Gregg, we grew up together. Actually, we grew up in right outside of East Lansing, Michigan, where Michigan State is located. And we went to middle school and high school together, friends. A lot of shenanigans growing up. And we
Nice.
both came to the University of Michigan for college. And we were both engineers. I was a chemical engineer. Ryan was a civil engineer. And we thought we were going to be engineers. That was going to be our career. But along the way, we were kind of bitten by the entrepreneurial bug. Ryan is a pretty handy guy, builds a lot of things, and he actually built a loft, which is currently now no longer a thing. But back then, 20 years ago, you built these wood frames to lift your beds up off the floor, so you had more room in your dorm because they're so small. And he built his. People started asking him to build one for them, and I got on board, started selling. He was building, and we had our first taste of entrepreneurship, building lofts during the move-in week at the university. So, it was a lot of fun. We did that for a couple of years, and it was everything. We were really bitten by the bug, but the problem is it was 1 week a year. So we were business owners 1 week a year and then had nothing else to do. So we were always, kind of like looking for something else that we could do. In the meantime, we were also taking classes, and I think we realized that while we appreciated and loved engineering, it was not what we wanted to do. It was not what kind of we thought it was going to be. And so when we've kind of been bitten by this entrepreneurial bug, that really started to take all of our attention. So along the way, I had my first car I ever bought with my own money was a Ford Probe GT Turbo. And JP,
Nice.
if you remember that car, it had the flip up lights, right? Like, I mean, it was very sweet looking, right? It was awesome. Unfortunately, it was not the most reliable car. I could have chose between that and a Honda Accord. And had I chosen the Accord, I would still be driving that Accord today. But
Right.
no, I chose the one with the cool flip up lights. That car broke down a lot. And one day I was driving on the highway, and the turbo blew up. And a tow truck driver that came to pick me up also was nice enough to give me a ride back to campus, and got to talking, heard his story, and he used to have a t-shirt company way back in the day, still had his equipment. And after a few other encounters, we ended up taking him out to dinner and making him an offer to buy his old 4-color press and small dryer. And by the way, he also let us set up shop in his garage that he lived in next to a broken down Chevy where his 2 golden retrievers slept. So that's the origin story. That's where we learned the first ins and outs of the screen printing industry.
That's awesome. Well, let's kind of fast forward. And as we stand today, I know all of our listeners like to, one of the early questions they have is, well, what does your production mix look like? Your production space, your facility, your equipment mix. So let's get that out of the way. I mean, fast forward nearly 20 years later, you folks have been in business for 20 years, if I have that right.
That's correct.
Give us a handle and a breakdown on your production capabilities.
Yeah, so we have in-house production in Ann Arbor. It's about 50,000 square feet. We have automatic, 10 automatics, about 30 36 or 40 heads of embroidery. Obviously, we have manuals, digital printing machines, transfer, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a pretty extensive equipment mix at this point. And then obviously, we're in, we obviously offer everything like most everyone does. However, internally, in-house, we produce apparel, only soft apparel items. So, but yeah, so we've been in, it's come a long way from a production standpoint, from that first go around in the tow truck driver's garage. And the funny kind of part about that is, we were set up in a garage, and for those people listening, they know, you need water to rinse out screens, and we were using the garden hose. Two things happened around November of that year, 2001. One was that I drove over the hose and broke the nozzle, so that was a big damper. And then two was that it was November in Michigan and the garden hose froze. And so
Right.
we've been through our fair share of trials and tribulations on the production front, all the way back to using a garden hose to spray out your screens.
Got it. Well, let's get into underground printing as a brand. So, can you give our listeners sort of a sense of how you're going to market and what your sort of brand presence looks like, to a new consumer?
Yeah. So, along the way, our story, I guess that segues nicely into the kind of the next iteration, next chapter of our story. So, at the time when we first started, we were called A1 Screen Printing, A-1 Screen Printing. And for the older listeners of the podcast, they'll of course know why. But for the younger listeners, I'll enlighten them. There used to be this thing called a phone book, and it was sorted alphabetically. And so if you wanted, the genius marketing of the time was to be first in the phone book. And in order to do that, you'd either be A1 or AAA. Like, that's where these names come from. So it was also kind of a homage to the tow truck drivers company, which was called A1 Shirt and Sign. So we named ourselves A1 Screen Printing. We were first in the phone book, and it was amazing. Then, some years later, cut 2 years later, essentially, this thing called Google came about, and then all of a sudden, it wasn't so genius marketing anymore. But what ended up happening was, because we had these issues with production early on, my driving and weather and so on and so forth, we actually ended up having to, we were able to sell, but we couldn't produce. So we started contracting out. And one of those places that we developed a relationship with was a place called Underground Printing. They had a couple automatic presses, and we got to know them pretty well. And they allowed us to continue to sell while they took care of production. We got so ingrained in their business, at a certain point, we decided, hey, we're going to go ahead and buy them out. And oh, by the way, since this name is kind of irrelevant now, we'll take their name too, because it better fits what we were all about. We were two college kids meeting people on campus. We were doing whatever it took to hustle and sell shirts, and it really kind of epitomized what we were all about. So along that way, though, we were catering to the college market, and we always just had dreams of like a store on campus. But custom apparel didn't seem to fit that. But we didn't really care. So we decided we were going to open up a location. And so in 2006, we opened up our first location on the main college drag, South University in Ann Arbor. And with that first location, we had some success, and we started to use that as our go-to-market strategy. We started opening up more locations. And we concentrated on college towns because that's what we knew. We were young. I was born in a college town, raised in another college town, lived in college towns all my life. To this day, lived in college towns all my life, and we really love them. So that was our focus, and it really became about the community. So like we, at that time when we started, circa 2001, 2002. All the big players were going online. Everyone thought we were going to be only transacting online, in the near future. And of course, we've gone through cycles of that. We learned that wasn't the case. Then omnichannel became a thing, and then the pandemic hit, and then of course we all were transacting online, and we're still trying to figure out the mix between online and bricks and mortar. But we really were infatuated with being a presence in the community, rooted in either the campus community, local community, the community of likes and dislikes, whatever it might be. And so we started opening up locations. And to this day, our physical locations throughout the country are a big part, the biggest part of who we are and what we feel like is core to who we are and makes us unique. So it's not the only part. It's not that, like all of the listeners out there, like, we obviously transact online, and especially in the last 18 months, right? But this mix of being able to deal with us in online, but also to know that we're a presence in your community is a really important part to us.
Nice. And I know a lot. It seems like we're hearing a lot about this notion of sort of expanding or extending rather the sort of the in-store retail experience online. So I think an organization like yours, where you're managing both an online presence and this retail, to create that sort of synergy between the two makes all the sense in the world. Well, Rishi, you bring up the notion of COVID, and I've been doing my damnedest to try to avoid, COVID as a discussion point, since we're all sort of inundated nonstop with COVID. But I also hate to date this particular podcast. But I think the reality is, we've all had to learn how to pivot, and we've learned a lot of lessons. And I think a lot of those lessons will stick and become just a part of our new DNA. So kind of give us a handle on some of the business lessons, or maybe the key lesson or takeaway you folks have had during sort of the COVID era.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a couple things I would say. Number one would be I will never again underestimate the value of being face to face with somebody. The importance of the relationship you create with someone in person, right? Obviously, technology is important, and we're always going to utilize virtual communication, Zoom, what have you, right?
Right.
But man, I think everyone can relate to what I'm saying. That first time that you were back in person with somebody, and chatting with them, face to face, it was awesome. I mean, it shouldn't have been that cool, but it felt great, right? And
Right.
we were lucky enough to have a lot of our sales managers in town actually the last few days, and to have that camaraderie, that in-person communication was just awesome. We'd forgotten what that was like. So I think that's a huge takeaway for me. Is of course we need to learn how to live in a virtual world, and there's lots of new technologies and new work norms that come from there. But the reality is if you want to be a community company, if you want to be a part of a community, you need to be present in that community. You need to be present together, and that was really solidified. And then secondarily, I would say that the other part is how important the people are, and the gratitude towards colleagues and team members, from the last 18 months, right? And
Sure.
how crisis brings people together, gets the juices flowing, the innovative juices flowing, right? Working through a crisis, and not everyone was able to work through the crisis. And in our industry, we had some life rafts that were thrown our way, right? Face masks and fundraisers and stuff like that, right? Things that InkSoft were helped people in our industry provide, right? So but not all industries have that, in the community
Right.
or in restaurants, events. Many of them did not have those opportunities. So, I consider ourselves lucky in that regard. And understanding this new world, and how you can be part of a community, how you can help your customers virtually and also exist on in person in the bricks and mortar world. I think navigating that's going to be interesting.
Agreed. Well, that's good perspective, great insights. Well, let's kind of take a look into the future. So, you're a mature business, been in business for 20 years. So, give us a handle on how you're thinking about sort of the future growth and future opportunities of underground printing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that one perspective that 20 years has given me is, uh, I'm happy that we made it 20 years. I'm happy to be here right now. That's maybe that's like a kind of a boring take, but I'll make that take. Um, and so for me, what's the future? I've kind of been only half joking, saying like, I want to be here in another 10 years. I want to be around in another 10 years. And
Right.
coming off of a global pandemic, that's not like a defeatist attitude by any means, right? Like being alive another 10 years is going to be an accomplishment. I really feel that way. Right. So, when you talk about growth, I think growth is intrinsic, inherent in existing, right? It's hard to be a business that shrinks and to continue to be around. That's just not really how, business works, right? So, what do we need to do that? Well, we need to continue to do what we do well. We need to adapt to this, like what the new world that's going to be, that's going to present itself in the next couple of years. We're going to need to understand the interplay between e-commerce and bricks and mortar, the omni-channel. What does omni-channel looks like? And we're gonna need to adapt to what the new, what our industry is dealing with in terms of what events look like, what businesses look like, what schools, universities look like. We still don't know yet, and I also apologize for dating this, but because we just don't know. We don't know what that's going to look like. So
Right.
I think the next few years, like we're all expecting it to, there's a lot of talk about the roaring 20s, to come back. And I believe in that, but I don't know what will change. I don't know how that will change. And, I do just have confidence in our team's ability to adapt based on how we adapted in the last, 18 months.
Love it. You sort of bring up a point I heard on a podcast not too long ago, but this notion of, it seems like everybody has to think about an exit strategy, whereas this podcast guest made the point about an exist strategy as opposed to
Yes,
exit strategy. So it sounds like
absolutely.
that's kind of where you're at. How do you continue to thrive? What do the next 20 years look like? So,
100%. When we first started, I talk a lot about like what is success. I was a chemical engineer, and what success was for me changed when I decided I was now going to print T-shirts for a living, right? And coming to grips with that, being the son of an academic, and really valuing, being the top of a field like chemical engineering. I had to really quickly come to grips on like what was success and what were my aspirational goals. Personally and for the business. And, what the path we did not choose was to, go online, try to achieve hockey stick growth. Rather, we achieve kind of more stable, boring growth, right? It's exciting and hard, and doesn't make it any harder or easier to do the kind of exist growth, right? Versus the exit growth. But it is not as exciting. It doesn't make it on Shark Tank. It doesn't get movies made about you.
right.
But it is what 99.9% of the businesses out there. That's what they are. That's where they came from. And for most of those businesses that we know, we just forget that like it took them 30 years to build a brand, right? It took them 40 years to build a brand. And a lot of the businesses that were flash in the pan brands that we've heard of, they went away after 5 years. They were bought and the brand was retired or
Yep.
whatever it might be. It's not exciting to have to embrace the grind, is my favorite way to say it, right? Like if you are to pitch and be like, yeah, well, it's going to take us 10 to 15 years, but we're going to figure out what we're doing. No investor likes to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that. That doesn't get stories written about you, but that's the reality.
Well, I love it. And I think it's the genuine and organic growth is the best. It's playing by your rules and not subscribing to what excites Wall Street, because we just don't play that game. So
Correct.
I like where your head's at. That's the best form of growth. Well, since we're playing Oracle here and looking towards the future, you've been in the space for a long time, so you've probably seen over 20 years all the different disruptions and changes in our industry. But what do you foresee? I mean, do you have any sort of keen predictions on the future of our industry? Do you see any disruptions or changes that people need to start thinking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what obviously one disruption our industry and all industries are dealing with is supply chain. Like we actually have a lot of dependency on a very specific supply chain, right? And
Right.
um, what that looks like is and how long it takes to remedy and what like changes come from it. It's going to be super interesting. I don't know what that eventually looks like. Um, so I don't know if that changes our industry, if that's just a minor blip. I hope it's not something that's super detrimental, but we just don't know yet. So the supply chain issue is one that's a huge disruption now, and probably by all accounts is going to be an issue for the next year. Um, that's a decent one. And then I think the uh, how larger companies and smaller companies exist. We're kind of in the middle, but there are obviously bigger players and mom and pops, and there's a lot of acquisitions in the promotional products space, right? And
Right.
a lot of aggregation there. I'm curious to see how that continues to play out. Does that transfer over into our space, into our soft, apparel space? I mean, I know you had in InkSoft, it's not just apparel; it's also hard goods as well. So, like, there's a lot
Right.
there. Um, that's going to be an interesting conversation. And how technology continues to change what we're doing, including how much easier it is, compared to 5-10 years ago to create to plug into an e-commerce platform like a Shopify, plug into a supplier network and start selling shirts. Right,
Right.
that has become easy, which is exciting, but also makes it very saturated. And that influx of just general apparel and like the ability to create apparel and the diversity is going to have some sort of impact, on the marketplace. And not, hopefully it's a growth of just overall acceptance of it, but it could be we don't need to buy company shirts or college shirts because I can just, like I'm buying individual shirts because like I know 12 people that are doing it. Even like things that were in the world of like name, image, likeness in the collegiate space, right? Well, now all
Yeah.
of a sudden you don't just buy your university apparel, you could also buy one shirt for every individual player, right? And that changes the game, changes the dynamic. So just a few things that are, I guess present right now. I'm not being a huge oracle here, going, 10 years into the future, but I think these are things that will play out over the next 1 to 5 years and will be interesting to see.
Got it. Well, a new question just came to mind. I mean, given your engineering mind and your background with chemical engineering, is there friction or tension, or how do you think about sort of applying your engineering sort of thinking to sort of the manufacturing production side of the business versus how are you allocating time to being the entrepreneur and the leader and focused on growing the business? Is that something that you're struggle with, or is that a thing?
No, not really. Not these days. I'm primarily focused on the forward facing the sales side. My partner Ryan kind of leads the overall organization, and then we have leaders in the operations and finance areas as well.
Got it.
Um,
That makes sense. That's
yeah,
good because it seems like one of the challenges we see is, you know, folks grapple with. It's just fun to be, meddling in production
for
and
sure,
new
for sure.
equipment, and
Oh,
it's just
100%.
the wrong place to invest time.
Well,
So
it's
good to hear
interesting.
that.
And what's super interesting, you think about it, is like very, obviously there's innovations, and there's innovations in the digital printing world, but the core, the crux of screen printing has not changed in years, right? Like there's been no
Right.
major impact since the advent of plastisol ink, essentially, right? And the automatic press, so Very much so. Screen printing is still somewhat of an art form and a craft. I think those of us in the industry still take pride in that. Right? There are good
Sure.
screen printers and not so good screen printers, and it takes a while
Right.
to learn. And just because you can set up a job doesn't mean you can print it well. Right? And there's a lot of variables in play. And I think, like I said, I think we take pride in that. All of us in the industry. Um, so technology hasn't, like, on the manufacturing side, hasn't like necessarily like completely taken hold and revolutionized it, and potentially that's one of the reasons that it's been able to maintain its fragmentation, compared to some other industries. So um, I do think it's interesting. It's ripe for that type of disruption, but I'm not sure where it comes from. I'm not sure where it's coming from.
Yeah, that's a good view, good perspective. Well, it's time for the retrospective questions. So let's transform those listening to another time, another place. So 20 years ago, when underground printing came into existence, circa 2001, Harry Potter, Sorcerer's Stone, all the rage. You've just started the business. You're learning how to be an entrepreneur and how to grow a business. So, sort of, if you were to be able to tunnel back in time and sort of give yourself advice, what would that look like?
Definitely, and I know my answer to this because it's like all good advice. You have to remind yourself of it very regularly. But I can't take credit for this advice, so I'm going to tell the story and give the credit where credit is due. So
Nice.
I was listening to a fireside chat in person with Dick Costolo at the University of Michigan, and Dick Costolo was the former CEO of Twitter, and also a University of Michigan alumni. So that's why he was there. And uh, he was telling a story about how, like, the best piece of advice, or the piece of advice he gives. And basically, the story he told was that he was in a Starbucks or something like that, and a kid came up to him and said, "Are you Dick Costolo?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And he's like, "Oh, I'm so and so. I'm in the next cohort of Y Combinator." And Dick was like, "Congratulations!" And he was like, "Well, what's the one piece of advice that you would give me?" And he said he thought about it, and that piece of advice was, "It never gets easier." And so this kid is obviously wide-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to go, and is like, you think, "Oh, well, we're going to achieve product market fit and it'll get easier." No. You think, "Oh, we're going to hit $5 million in sales and then it'll get easier." No. You think, "Oh, we're going to go public and then it'll get easier." No, it won't. At every stage, the problems of a year ago seem trivial, and the problems you have right now are still hard, and they're only going to get worse. And if you get into this world of entrepreneurship, and imagine this grass is greener kind of vision, where it's like, "Oh, it'll get easier. I'll get less stressed about it over here." You're kidding yourself. And I heard this at a time where I needed to hear that, right? Like, it is about, my term on it is embrace the grind, right? It never gets
Right.
easier. So if you don't love that, if you don't thrive in that, then it's not for you. And, so if I was going to go back, I would say, be ready to be in it for 15, 20 years, embrace the grind. It never gets easier.
I love it. And I'm pleased that you didn't say "fell fast and fell forward." I think some of the worst advice that we continues to be perpetuated, especially in the tech community. It's like, who can afford all of this failure? Who can
100%.
fund? And it's a interesting notion, but that's a great story and
I
certainly great advice.
So it's funny you mentioned the fail fast. So you and I are kindred spirits in that regard. I actually think that is, um, that's I actually think propagating this term "fail fast" is actually what holds people back, because,
For sure.
you know, innately, if you are someone who is okay with the term failure, you're like, that's a tough place to then be, like a driver of success, right? And so
For sure.
I think, like, I understand the genesis of that term, but I replaced it with embrace the fast B. And so I have this kind of like philosophy of, there are multiple ways to approach a problem, And if you can either be the person that wants the slow A, like you have to get it perfect, you have to be 100%, or you can be a person that wants the fast B, which is, get there, get something done, and be okay with it being 80, 85%, and then know that you have to iterate it and iterate it and iterate it and iterate it. That's the grind, right? That's how it never gets easier. And uh, reframing it in that way means that, like, hey, you're gonna just have to make some assumptions, you're gonna have to make some guesses, you're not gonna be perfect, and then you're gonna learn from it, and then you're gonna go again, and then you're gonna go again. And that's not sometimes not that exciting, right? Because there's no end point to that. There's no
Right.
A. You never got to the perfect A. You always are getting a B. And I frame it that way, and it makes a lot more sense to me.
Love it. All right. Here's my next question for you, Rishi. Here's a bit of a curveball. So, of course, everybody loves a villain in a great story, right? So, who or what experience has been a major obstacle in your story at Underground Printing, and how have you folks, dealt with it and overcome it?
Wow, that's a
And
tough
not COVID.
question.
No COVID era.
Yeah, no,
That's too easy.
that's a cop out. Yeah, no, definitely, that's a fair cop out. Here's what I would say. I already alluded to it, and I would say that the villain became the hero for us. So our first villain was Google, because we created this name, and then just like that, Google made it irrelevant, and things can change that quickly. It was like 2 years,
Right.
right? I mean, like, all of a sudden, the basis of our company, the name you form that people think is so important, all of a sudden, uh, if you go to college today, I have to explain to you why we would have come up with that name. I mean, that's kind of crazy that would be that revolutionary. However, the reason the villain became the hero, uh, in our account, I guess people have all sorts of commentary on Google, but the reason in our account the villain became the hero was by virtue of wanting to expand the offering that Google did. They started to place a priority on local and the community, and
Right.
so we initially we were not competitors in the world of organic search and paid ads, and there were much bigger players that we all know that were winning that game. But then all this work we did, opening up locations and becoming embedded in communities, paid off when Google decided, like, hey, we want to show the local results. We want to show how, you can find things locally. And so that's where the villain became the hero. So off the top of my head, that's the one that comes up, although, maybe not what you were looking for.
No, that's perfect. And I imagine that you'll have to contend with that into the future as Google continues to, alter their algorithms. And yeah, that's something that I think is going to become a perpetual and constant source of grief.
100%.
So, being again, having been an entrepreneur for 20 years now, if our listeners were to jump off, this podcast and go sort of do one thing, whether it be a business strategy or a tactic, I mean, is there any one thing that you could suggest that people start to focus on to get some uplift and improvement in their business?
Yeah. I would say, I guess the biggest thing on my end is just like how to improve your own productivity and efficiency, right?
Yep.
We have less time in the day than we ever have had before, right? And it becomes harder and harder. And I challenge students of mine to like look for the tools and the processes and the checklists and the things that like give them structure and organization. And I used to be a person that took pride in the being the, like, oh, that's Rishi, the absent-minded, kooky, goofy guy that forgot stuff and was late to stuff. Like, that was kind of my MO. Ryan always, my partner Ryan always had this saying for my family growing up. He was like, you tell Rishi, the time is, Rishi's going to be late by 15 minutes. His mom's going to be late by 25 minutes, and his dad just may not show, right? Like, that was our joke. That was a running joke. That was a kind of a thing. And
It's a genetic thing, right?
it was a genetic thing. It was a cultural thing, right? Like, being late, and my dad's a professor and very much an absent-minded type professor. And like, it was just like, that was going to be, that's a kind of our ongoing joke as a family. And but I had to break out of that mold because like I couldn't exist as an
Yeah.
entrepreneur. I couldn't exist as a business owner or as a dad or and a partner for that matter, with that as my MO, right? I had to take the organizational kind of leap. So um, I that would be my challenge. That would be my best practice, is improve those types of uh, processes, and find those tools and those strategies that work for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great advice. So I have a question, sort of a two-part question, and I'm always interested to understand what inspires you, and sort of secondly, another view is where do you go for inspiration? Is there a particular personality that you follow on Twitter that's a good source that folks ought to be following or looking into?
Um, I would say. Can you state that again? I'm sorry, I blanked
Yeah,
a
and
little bit.
just sort of interested. We'll start with the first part. What inspires you to keep up, as you mentioned,
Yeah,
that sort of that grind and looking
yeah.
towards the future.
Honestly, one of the biggest thing for me, um, was I got the opportunity to teach, to go back to my alma mater, University of Michigan, and actually teach e-commerce entrepreneurship.
Oh,
And
wow.
initially, I was excited to do it because, remember, I was going to be a chemical engineer, potentially an academic, and my dad is an academic, and so this was part of my like, hey, I have my opportunity to do this, right? I can be quote unquote professor too, not really, but a lecturer, whatever.
Right.
And but then after doing that for 3 or 4 semesters, that gets old real quick. So you got to find some other, like, show, proving yourself to your dad, only lasts for a little while. You got to like find some other benefits to it. And so, really, actually, what it has forced me to do is become like heavily rooted in the fundamentals of e-commerce entrepreneurship, right? Constantly looking into what's changing, what's new, because I want to be up to date so I can teach what's up to date. Because as you know, it's changing every month, changing
Sure.
every 2 weeks, and so I can't, like, this isn't organic chemistry. I can't. The laws are not like set in stone for the rest of eternity, right? Like I have to be up to date every single semester with new content and new things. That forces me to do that. Otherwise, I'm becoming obsolete. But I take a lot of pleasure and pride in that because I feel up to date. I feel like I'm in the know of what's new and what's innovative. So, what I guess inspires me to stay up to date on what is going on is I have to say, I think I had the personality for that before. Otherwise, I would not have been successful moving forward. But it is nice to have tied it to an accountability, right? So if you're accountable to stay up to date, if you have an accountability to be in the know on where innovation is happening in your industry, and then I'm almost in the broader industry of entrepreneurship and in e-commerce in general. That makes it, that gives you some direction. I just got done saying you need to find those tools, those checklists, those pushes that keep you organized, keep you productive. Well, in this case, lecturing is one of those things for me.
That's awesome. And it sounds like the real thesis there is it's about new knowledge and educating yourself so that you can be accountable to teaching your students. That's great.
That's exactly right. If I don't know it, then how can I teach it? If I'm not up to date, then what credibility do I have? Is how I look at it.
That's really cool. So in looking at, underground printing social media channels, I see a lot of postings where you're showing a customer or a group or an organization, with whatever goods they of course purchase, the branded products that are part of the story. So obviously you folks are serving a ton of groups and organizations and individuals, and you're helping them out with branded goods. So I guess my final question is there a specific example in your history that comes to mind in terms of how underground printing was able to really help an organization or move the needle on an initiative? Is there any, particular example that comes to mind?
You know, I you kind of let drop that you were gonna, you know, bring this up, and I wish I had just one example, but unfortunately for me, I have like 20 years, and my memory is just not that good.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
but
unfair.
what I can tell you what I'm proud. I'm proud of a few things. I'm proud of the fact that we still have customers that were those first few customers that gave us orders, gave us a shot 20 years ago.
Right.
And obviously when you first start, they're connections of yours. They're people that or the friends and family around you. But to be able to hold on to some of those same customers 20 years, later is really cool. It makes it all, very, very gratifying, So I would say first is that having kept customers for 20 years is something is an example of something I'm really proud of. And secondarily, I think I'm not alone in this. I think anyone in our industry feels this way. We are lucky that the service we provide, the product that we provide, is something that people love.
Right.
Something that people are excited about. They want to talk about, right? And it's an asset to people's events and groups and organizations. And I've learned a ton about nonprofits and how they work and operate, and by virtue of just being a provider of apparel to them. And some of the relationships have been formed, and some of the charity and donations that we've been able to help facilitate or make ourselves has been really awesome. And we love everyone's events and groups and organizations, but when we're helping uh, you know charities that are focused on kids, I those are things that just really pop out in my mind, and make me proud to be a part of that community.
That's awesome. Well, Rishi, Narayan of Underground Printing, I want to be mindful and respectful of your time. I'm thankful that you took time out of your busy schedule to join us and illuminate to our listeners, what Underground Printing is all about, and your story. It's been really exciting to watch your growth and see the numbers transact through InkSoft, and to see how you folks continue to grow and iterate. And I'm certainly looking forward to watching that story continue. So we wish you all the best. And again, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, JP. It's fun to be able to talk a little industry shop, and I don't get to do that all that often, so that's fun. Thank you.
Nice. And for our listeners, we will link to, we recently conducted a customer spotlight on you folks, and we'll link some of your social channels so folks can do some additional research and follow you, and keep up to follow your future growth.
Thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Awesome, Rishi. Well, thank you again.
Take care.
Be well.